Montana Territory, 1882, the snow had not yet melted off the edges of the Bitterroot Mountains when Weston Zane stepped out of the barn and heard the crying. It was not the usual mewling of a calf or the yip of a coyote. This was sharp and human and coming from the edge of his land where the forest met the clearing. He dropped the saddle blanket he had been shaking out and ran, boots crunching over frost-hardened ground. When he reached the old pine stump near the trail, he saw the basket, two of them twins. They were wrapped in a worn quilt, cheeks red from the cold, mouths open in protest. A folded scrap of paper lay tucked into the edge of the basket. "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. Their names are Tobias and Tessa. Please take care of them." Weston's chest tightened. He looked up and down the trail, but whoever had left them was long gone. He crouched, staring at the tiny faces. "Well," he muttered, voice rough with disbelief, "what in God's name am I supposed to do now?" He took them in. There was no choice in it. The cabin was quiet that night, the fire snapping in the hearth, and the twins laying in a makeshift cradle Weston had fashioned from an old apple crate and a bedroll. He sat on the floor beside them, elbows on knees, staring. He was 29, a widower for 3 years, a cattleman with calloused hands and a quiet life. He did not know the first thing about babies. By morning he was running on no sleep, a shirt stained with milk and nerves frayed to threads. By the third day he was nearly broken. "You two are going to finish me off," he said, holding Tobias against his chest while bouncing on the balls of his feet. Tessa wailed in the cradle. "I do not know what you want. Is it food, sleep? You want me to sing, because I will not do that." He did anyway, badly. The next day he hitched the wagon and rode into town. He needed supplies, bottles, something for diapering. He needed help, and that was when he saw her. She stepped out of the mercantile with a sack of flour balanced on one hip and 2 jars of preserves clutched in her arms. She was tall and strong-looking, with a face that held more determination than softness, though her eyes quiet, steady, green stopped him cold. "Caroline," he said before he even realized it. She turned, and her brow lifted in surprise. "Weston Zane. I thought you vanished off the face of the earth." "I did," he said, still holding the reins. "Then 2 babies showed up on my porch." She blinked. "What? They're in the wagon," he said, nodding toward the bundle tucked in the back under the blanket. "Twins, a boy and a girl. Someone left them for me." Caroline Mather set down the flour, stepped past the front hitch and looked into the wagon. She was quiet for a moment, then looked back at him. "You have no idea what you're doing, do you?" "Not a single clue." She looked at the twins again, then at Weston. "I will help you," he stared. "You what?" "I will help you raise them," she said, her voice calm but clear. "As my own." He could not think of a single thing to say. He had not spoken to Caroline in years. Not since they were teenagers, back when she still wore her braids long and he had been too awkward to say anything real to her. Life had scattered them. She had gone east to help her aunt in Minnesota. He had stayed, married young, buried a wife, and built a quiet life on his father's old land. And now here she was, offering to raise 2 abandoned children with him. "Why would you do that?" he asked. Caroline looked down at the babies, her face softer now. "Because they need someone, and because you look like you are about to fall over dead." "I might be," she smiled just a little. "Then let me help." They married 2 weeks later in a quiet civil ceremony under the cottonwoods by the river. Not out of love, not yet, but out of necessity. It was the only way for her to stay, to care for the twins, to be under the same roof without scandal. Weston built a second cradle. Caroline made formula from goat's milk and cornstarch. They took turns at night. He watched her move around the kitchen with quiet ease, her hands steady, her voice low and calm even when the babies screamed for hours. She read to them. She sang to them in a voice so soft it made his chest ache. The log cabin, once still and silent, now pulsed with life. Caroline never complained, not once, not when Tessa would not sleep. Not when Tobias got sick and she sat up all night with him pressed to her chest. Not when Weston, exhausted and irritable, snapped over something small. One night after the twins had finally gone quiet, Weston found her out by the fence, arms folded on the top rail, staring out at the hills. He walked over and stood beside her. The moon was rising over the ridge. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke. "I do not know how to thank you," he said. You do not need to, she replied. I do, you saved me, Caroline. She turned her head, met his gaze. You were always kind to me, Weston. Back when we were young, you were the only boy who ever brought my horse back when she wandered. I remembered that. He smiled just a little. You remembered my horse-thieving days, huh? I remembered you. The silence stretched, not awkward, just full. I was going to ask you to a dance once, he said, when we were 16, but you left before I could. She looked at him, and something shifted between them. Something unspoken but real. You still can, Caroline said, her voice low. He took her hand. And right there, under the stars, Weston Zane danced with the woman who had stepped into his life like sunlight through a storm. The babies slept. The wind whispered through the grass. And something new began. The wind shifted over the grasslands in late spring, bringing with it the scent of thawed earth and the first bloom of wild rose. Weston came in from checking the east fence line with a streak of mud up one sleeve and a quiet weight behind his ribs he hadn't noticed carrying until he saw the cabin lamp lit through the window. Inside, Caroline sat at the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, darning a pair of his socks with careful stitches. Tobias was on her lap, cheeks damp but eyes half-lidded, and Tessa lay curled in the cradle Weston had built, one hand fisted tight around the hem of Caroline's apron that trailed nearby. I didn't expect you back before sundown, she said, glancing up. Fence held better than I thought, he replied, brushing dirt from his hands. You get them down earlier today. Tessa wore herself out fighting sleep. Tobias needed walking for most of an hour. He looked at the child in her arms, then at the way Caroline's hand moved slowly over his back, fingers rubbing in a small, steady circle. The boy relaxed with a long sigh. She settles them faster than I can, Weston said. Maybe they know I mean business. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. You always mean business. She gave a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. I suppose I do. He crossed the room, kneeling beside the chair until he was eye level with his son. You trust her, don't you? He murmured. Tobias blinked and reached out, catching Weston's chin between clumsy fingers. Caroline didn't look away. He's taken to you more than you know. I worry I'll ruin it. You won't. He looked up. How can you be sure? Because you listen. Because you try, that's more than most children get. He stood slowly and took Tobias from her. The boy went without protest, settling into his father's arms with a little grunt of effort. Weston pressed his lips to the top of his son's soft head. I didn't think I'd ever carry a child again, he said. I didn't think I'd ever hold one, she answered. They didn't speak for a while. The fire popped and settled. Caroline returned to her darning, though her eyes flicked up now and then as if to memorize the picture of Weston and the boy beneath the warm glow of oilite. Later, after the children were asleep and Weston had banked the hearth, they stepped out onto the porch. The moon was high, casting silver over the yard and the barn beyond. A coyote called faint and far off. Weston leaned against the rail, arms folded, while Caroline stood beside him, her shawl drawn tight across her shoulders. There's a stillness to this place, she said. I never noticed it before. It's different now that it's not just me here, she nodded. I thought I'd miss the noise of town, but I don't. What did you do there besides help your aunt? I taught reading. Just a few children once or twice a week. Some were too old for school, some too poor to attend, but they wanted to learn. He angled toward her. You'd be good at that. I liked it, she said. But I always felt like I was waiting for something, not sure what. And now, I don't feel that way anymore. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached out, letting his fingers brush hers along the porch rail. She didn't pull away. Her hand turned, palm up, and he took it gently. Her skin was rough in places, from scrub and wash, but warm. She looked at him then, fully, and something passed between them, neither fast nor sudden, but slow as the river thawing in spring, steady as the turning of soil. I'm not in a hurry, he said. Neither am I. They stayed like that until the night air turned sharp, and when they went back inside, it was without words but with a quiet understanding tucked between them. That week, Caroline cleared a patch of earth behind the cabin. Weston watched from the barn as she bent to the soil, planting seeds she'd brought in burlap from town onions, beans, and a row of marigolds along the edge. She tied her hair back different now, not in the thick braids she wore when she first arrived, but looped and pinned for ease, the ends curling near her collar. He brought her a tin cup of water when midday heat crept in. "Thank you," she said, wiping sweat from her brow. "What made you think of a garden? Seemed foolish to live on land and not use the soil. You think of everything?" "I think about what's needed," she said, "and flowers." "I missed flowers." She looked up then, her face flushed with effort, and he knelt beside her, brushing a thumb across the smudge of dirt on her cheek. "You've made this place warmer," he said. She didn't answer, but her eyes softened. She placed her hand over his, and for a moment the garden, the children, the cabin, all of it felt less like pieces of separate lives and more like something whole. That night, Weston carved a length of pine into a small horse, smooth and simple. He gave it to Tessa the next morning, and Caroline smiled in a way he hadn't seen before, quiet and proud. She never asked for anything, but he began to give without being asked. The days stretched longer. The twins grew heavier in his arms. And the cabin, once a place he simply returned to, began to feel like home by early summer. The cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out thick and green, and the meadow behind the cabin had begun to hum with bees and the low shuffle of cattle moving through grass. Weston sat on the stoop sharpening a draw-knife when Caroline stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Someone rode up the south trail," she said. He stood immediately, scanning the ridge. "You see who?" "Just the shape of a man." "Didn't look like a neighbor." Weston set down the knife and headed for the barn where his rifle leaned just inside the door. He returned with it slung low against his side and eyes fixed on the trail as the rider came into view. The stranger was lean, with a sun-darkened face and a coat that hung too loose on his frame. His horse was lathered, hooves tossing up dust as it slowed. He raised a hand in greeting but didn't smile. "Looking for Weston Zane," he called. "I'm him." The man dismounted stiffly. "Name's Arlen Tate. I came from over near Helena. I think we need to talk." Caroline stepped back out, arms folded, the screen door creaking behind her. Weston glanced at her, then nodded toward the inside. "Can you take the children to the back room?" She didn't question him. Once she was gone, Weston turned to the man. "What's this about?" Arlen reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, creased and smudged. "You were sent a letter from a woman named Hattie Green about 2 babies. Weston's jaw tightened. "She left them here near 2 months back. No return since." "I'm her brother," Arlen said. "She passed outside of Missoula. Fever took her quick." Weston looked away, jaw working. "She didn't leave a name, only a note. She was in a bad way, husband run off, no means. She wrote me before she died, said she'd left the children with someone decent, told me to find them if I could." "You came all this way for that?" "Their blood," Arlen said, "but I ain't here to take them." Weston blinked. "What then?" "I just wanted to see they were safe. That they wasn't in some orphanage or worse." Weston studied the man's face. There was no guile in it, only weariness. "They're safe," Weston said. "They've got a home." Arlen nodded once. "Can I see him?" Weston hesitated, then stepped aside and called Caroline. She came out with Tobias on her hip and Tessa clinging to her skirt. Arlen crouched down slow, looking between them with something like grief in his eyes. "They got her eyes," he said quietly. "That's her boy's nose, though." Tessa hid behind Caroline's leg. Tobias reached a hand toward Arlen, curious. "You can tell her they're well," Caroline said, "if you still talk to her." "She's gone," Weston said. Caroline's face shifted just slightly. "I'm sorry." Arlen stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "I should be riding on. You need a meal before you go?" Weston asked. "I won't take more than I need, but I'd be grateful." They ate together at the table while the children napped. Arlen had a quiet way of speaking, voice low and even, and his stories were short, mostly about cattle and weather. He didn't ask many questions, just watched the two of them with the ease of someone who'd carried too much for too long. "I see how you look at her," he said to Weston after supper once they'd stepped out to the porch again. "You don't gotta say it." Weston said nothing. "You're doing right by them," Arlen added. "That's more than most would do." He rode out before sunset, and Weston watched until the dust from his horse faded into evening. When he stepped back inside, Caroline was folding the quilts from the cradle. "I wasn't expecting kin," she said. "Neither was I." She placed the folded cloth on the rocker and met his gaze. "You all right? I thought maybe someone would come for them. I just didn't expect to want them to stay so much." Caroline walked over and laid her hand against his chest, fingers catching on the edge of his shirt. "They're yours, Weston, ours." He covered her hand with his. "You're not afraid of what comes next. I've already walked away from a life that didn't fit. This one might be harder, but it's honest." He leaned down, his forehead touching hers. "You've given me more than I knew how to want. I didn't come here to change anything," she whispered, "but it's the first time I've felt like I belong." His lips brushed hers, tentative at first, then sure. When they parted, the room was still, the only sound the low rustle of wind against the shutters. That night, he carried both children to the back room while Caroline laid out the bedding. They moved around one another without need for words, each gesture practiced now, familiar. When the lantern was turned down and the silence settled in, Weston reached across the space between their beds and took her hand. She didn't let go. The first rain came in the night, soft against the tin roof, steady enough to lull the children into heavier sleep. Caroline rose before the light touched the sky, easing out from under the quilt without waking Weston. She lit the stove and fed it kindling, moving slow so the floorboards wouldn't creak beneath her steps. Outside, the earth smelled darker, rich with the promise of growth. The garden had taken well, and the beans had sent out thin green shoots that curled upward in search of something to hold. She knelt beside them, pushing back the wet hair clinging to her temple, and cleared away the weeds crowding the marigolds before they could steal the strength from the soil. Weston found her there after tending to the calves, his boots damp, his hat dripping. He crouched beside her, not speaking at first. The quiet had become a comfort between them, not the kind that pressed heavy, but the kind that allowed space for breath. "You ever think about adding chickens?" he asked. She brushed the mud from her palms. "I thought about it yesterday, didn't expect you to mention it." "I saw a coop in back of the Greeley place. They're not using it." "Man's half-blind now, moved into town with his daughter. You want to haul it here? I'll check with him first, but it'd be good for eggs. Good for Tessa and Tobias later on, too." She reached for a sprouting weed and tugged it free. "You already thinking that far ahead?" He didn't answer right away. "I think about it more than I thought I would." She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. He rose with her, close enough for his coat to brush her sleeve. "I never pictured this either," she said, voice low. This, she gestured toward the garden, the house behind them, the faint shape of the children through the window. "A place that expects something of me and someone who doesn't ask more than I can give." He watched her for a long moment. "You don't owe me anything, Caroline." "I know," she said. "That's why I stay." That afternoon, Weston rode north to speak with Greeley about the coop. Caroline stayed behind, moving through the cabin with Tobias strapped to her back and Tessa tugging at her skirt. She kept a steady rhythm with her work kneading dough, sweeping the floor, hanging laundry from the covered porch despite the damp air. The children followed her like ducklings, never far, and she spoke to them softly as she worked, telling them what each tool was, the names of herbs she hung from the rafters, the way to tell when bread had risen enough to bake. When Weston returned, the coop tied down in the wagon bed, he found her seated on the porch with Tessa asleep in her lap and Tobias curled beside her. She was humming low, not a song he knew, something lilting and slow. He stepped up and reached for the boy gently, careful not to wake him. "Got the coop," he said. She nodded. "I saw you coming." They were waiting, but didn't last. "Greeley gave us 6 hens and a rooster," said they're used to people. "You think we'll be any good at it? I think we'll figure it out same as everything else." That night, after the children were laid down, Caroline washed the flour from her forearms and tied her hair back. Weston was sitting at the small table, carving another toy, this one a bear, rough and unfinished. She walked over, drying her hands on a cloth, and sat beside him. "You ever think about what we'll tell them?" she asked. He set the knife down. "About where they came from?" "Yes." He looked at the carving, then at her. "When they're old enough to ask, we'll tell them truthfully that their mother couldn't stay, that someone else came and chose to." She folded the cloth and laid it on her lap. Do you ever wonder what she would have done if she'd had more time? I wonder if she was hoping we'd be the kind of people who'd keep them together. Caroline met his eyes. We are. Weston reached for her hand, not tentative this time, but sure. She let her fingers twine with his, her thumb brushing the ridge of his knuckles. I've been thinking, he said, about building on to the house. A room at the back, maybe two. If we're going to raise them here, they'll need space. She leaned into him, her shoulder beneath his. I'd like that. And I'd like you to have something of your own in it, a room for books or sewing if that's what you want. You've given more than I've asked. I don't need a room to feel rooted, she said, I know, but I want you to have one anyway. She turned her head toward him. You're not the man I expected when I came here. I wasn't much of anything when you came here. You were kind. That's more than enough. He kissed her then, not in haste or uncertainty, but with the quiet conviction of a man who had waited long enough to know what was real. She returned it with the ease of someone who had spent years learning to guard her heart, and now chose to open it. When they parted, she didn't look away. I want this, Weston, not for obligation for me. I want it too, he said. They sat there, hands twined between them, the fire casting long shadows across the plank floor, and the steady breath of their sleeping children filling the room like a promise. By midsummer, the cabin smelled of sun-warmed wood and fresh bread. The coop was finished, the hens settled, and the children had begun to pull themselves up on the furniture, their little legs shaky but determined. Caroline started setting aside scraps of muslin for new clothes, her stitches fine and practical. Weston, in turn, spent the early mornings shaping pine boards for the room he'd promised her, the scent of sawdust clinging to his skin long after he'd washed. One evening, as the sun sank low over the western ridge, Weston returned from the pasture with a crease between his brows. He stepped into the kitchen where Caroline was straining rosehip tea for Tessa's cough, her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned up in a twist that had started to unravel. There's talk in town, he said, voice quiet but firm. A man came through from Butte, says a mining company's been buying up land west of here, near enough to raise concern. Caroline set the strainer down slowly. You think they'll come this far? They might, and if they do, they'll want water rights. That stream behind the barn's no secret. Her gaze met his. What can we do? I'm going to file to secure the homestead proper. We're settled, but I never put it through the county. I thought it didn't matter. Now it does. She nodded once. We'll go together. I'll need to head in tomorrow. I'll pack provisions. He hesitated, then added, it might take 2 days, maybe 3. I'll stop by the notary in Hamilton first. Caroline folded the tea cloth carefully. I can manage the children, I know, he said. But I don't like leaving you if this gets messy. I've handled worse. He stepped closer, his hand brushing the edge of her waist. I just found something worth protecting. I don't want to let it slip. You won't, she leaned up then, pressing her mouth to his cheek, not hurried or shy. Just steady. He wrapped his arms around her and held on. The next morning, she kissed him once on the porch and handed him a satchel with bread, cheese, and dried venison. He rode west with the sun rising behind him, the earth still damp from a night rain. Caroline stood with Tobias on her hip and Tessa clutching her skirts, watching until he crested the ridge. On the second evening, just after she'd settled the children and lit the lamp, a knock came at the door. She reached for the small pistol Weston kept atop the cabinet and opened the door a crack. It was the notary's assistant, a wiry young man with a polite tone and dust on his boots. Ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. Your husband asked me to bring word. He's safe. Paperwork's filed, but he'll be another day. There was talk of a counterclaim, but it didn't hold. She nodded once. Thank you. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. He asked me to give you this. She waited until the man had ridden off before unfolding it, the firelight casting flickers on the ink. Caroline, the land's ours now, official, signed, and witnessed. No one's taking it from under us. I stood in that office and realized I've never wanted anything more than I want this life with you, with them, with us. I'll be home tomorrow evening. She folded the note slowly, pressing it to her chest, then tucked it into the drawer beside the hearth. When Weston returned the next day, dust-covered and bone-tired, she met him at the edge of the yard, bare feet in the grass, her hand resting lightly on her belly. He dismounted, eyes narrowing. "You all right?" She took his hand and laid it gently over her stomach. He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment before something shifted across it, quiet understanding, then awe. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." They stood there as the sky turned gold behind them, the children squealing from the porch where they'd spotted him, and the hens clucking lazily in the coop behind the house. That night, after the children had been tucked into their beds and the lamp was turned low, Weston pressed his forehead to hers in the stillness. "I didn't think I'd get another chance," he murmured. She touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "You didn't just get a chance. You built something with it. I want to give you more. You already have." Later, as they lay together in the narrow bed they'd shared with a polite distance for weeks, she turned toward him fully, her fingers brushing the edge of his shirt. "Weston," she whispered, voice steady, "I love you." He reached for her then, gently, his hand slipping to the small of her back as he tucked her against his chest. "I love you too, with everything I've got left." They didn't speak more that night. They didn't need to. Seasons turned. The garden flourished. Tessa learned to run, then to sing, and Tobias followed her everywhere she went. The new room was built by autumn, a square addition with wide windows and shelves Caroline filled with books Weston bought 2 at a time from town. He carved a cradle from cedar before the first snow came, and when their daughter was born in the hush of winter, they named her Lark, for the bird Caroline once dreamed of hearing. The cabin grew louder with laughter and clumsy feet. Weston and Caroline worked side by side, raised children, and lived without pretense. They still danced in the kitchen sometimes, without music. Still met each other's eyes across a room crowded with toys and half-finished sewing, and knew they'd chosen right. And when the years passed, as years do, they were never counted in loss, but in harvests, in birthdays. In the quiet way, Weston would reach for Caroline's hand each night before sleep, and she would always reach back.